I'm John Batchelor. Mary Kissel of the Wall Street Journal editorial board is here with me. And Mary, I've been doing my homework, your guidance on housing, and I want to get to housing quickly, but I want to start with the American Jobs Act. Conversation with a colleague of ours from Hoover Institution, Richard Epstein, who's a Lawrence A. Tisch Professor of Law at NYU, about the American Jobs Act, and I'll characterize it this way, that the President's presentation at the joint session of Congress contains not only no new ideas, but also a sentimental version of employment, much of it directed at blue states. And the puzzle, and Richard and I debated this, the puzzle is the president naive and believes that we don't see things like Teacher Stabilization Act and construction jobs and other handoffs to his union colleagues is just straight up electioneering? He's naive and he doesn't think we see that? Or he's cynical and does it anyway? Can you make a choice here?
It could be something of both, John. But I think the remarkable thing about the American Jobs Act is that even the Democrats in Congress aren't supporting it. So, you would think that before the president came out with this plan, that, by the way, it took a month to put together, that he might have, I don't know, gotten together with his colleagues in the Senate and the House and said, guys, are you on board with this? Is this something you can get behind?
To ask us to give up more billions of dollars for the Teacher Stabilization Act, which is one out of three attendees of the Democratic National Convention are teachers.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. This is an act to employ Democratic voters, construction workers, teachers, all those guys. And over half of it is a temporary tax cut, which isn't going to change anybody's incentives to work, save, or invest.
That's a point we'll get to in just a moment. I want to spend some time with housing. What I learned also this week is that the banks, which continue to decline even when market has a good day, the banks are stuck with a portfolio of bad loans, foreclosed loans, for 3 years now. And the explanation I got from Don Kopecky, who covers banking for Bloomberg, is 3 years ago, the Obama administration made a decision that they believed it would be too harsh, too deadening if they allowed people to lose their homes as they'd lost their jobs.
Right.
And so they started interference. You've talked about some of those programs.
That's right.
And they extend those programs all the time, even though there's not big participation. Then it turned into the robo-signing scandal. Then it turned into foreclosure fixing. It's now 3 years later, and the banks are pointing to that, all that interference, as one of the inhibitors about their own growth, clearing their books. So what started out well-intentioned paved Hades, the proverb.
Well, the crazy thing about this reaction is that the idea that somehow foreclosing on a home would throw people out onto the streets is nonsense. We have things called rental units, and many of the people who owned homes in America simply could not afford to have them, shouldn't have had them in the first place, and belong in rental units. So I think what you're seeing now, 3 to 4 years into this bubble bursting, is the administration really grasping at straws. We talked on previous programs, John, about this idea of trying to extend a refinancing program. The president talked about this in his speech a couple of weeks ago. That's still floating around out there. No one in the marketplace thinks that this is going to do much of anything. And meanwhile, you're right. All of these bad loans on the books of banks like, say, Bank of America are really weighing these banks down. But broadly speaking, it weighs down the economy, because if you can't sell your home and move to another state or county or city where there's a job, you're kind of stuck. So you have to let this market find a bottom. You got to kick the people out who can't afford the homes and let people who can't afford them buy them.
Right. You got to be tough. It's tough love. Now, Mary, in addition to well-intentioned actions by the government, by the president, by the Obama administration, this is especially in the first 2 years, I spoke with another Hoover Institution fellow, Leo Hanian, a professor of economics at UCLA, who wrote with a colleague of his, Mr. Cole, who's a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and learned that there are comparisons to be made between the policies of Franklin Roosevelt, the New Deal, the emergency policies of 1933, 34 through 38, and the activity of the Obama administration. Perhaps self-conscious, perhaps there was some imitation of the New Deal that was going on in the 2009, 2010. But I learned, generally speaking, that when the government interferes in the marketplace to pick winners or to make it possible for people to have their wages raised, not only does it not create aggregate demand, that's the aim of stimulus packages, it doesn't actually clear the problem, which is that private enterprise will not take risks, that private enterprise is cautious and backs out. In the 1930s, it was more evident because there was a worldwide deflation and there was huge joblessness. But the general point is that government interference, government manipulation, the stimulus package is anti-growth. It's anti-success. It's anti-business. Now, I listen to this, and I'm a sucker for academic arguments. Does this measure for you, Mary, that everything the Obama administration has been doing these last 2 years, thinking that it was helping us, that we were going to get through this bad patch, has made it worse?
Well, yes, that's you've just summed it up beautifully, John.
But that's a terrible judgment.
It is. It's a damning judgment because when we talk about in these numbers, these very sterile numbers, 9.1% unemployment. I don't think that really conveys the pain that families feel when somebody loses their job. And remember, this is an average number. You go to places like Michigan or some of the Rust Belt states, you're talking numbers that are much higher than 9.1%. And you look at people who maybe don't have a college degree, and you're also talking about numbers that are much higher than 9.1%.
The National Recovery Administration, this is an artifact of history. It was eventually ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in a very famous decision. But in any event, in the early years, it was all the energy of FDR. It was his stimulus program.
Right.
I'm told one aspect of the NRA was that it was going to insist that wages were raised at certain industries. And in order to do this, they actually vouchsafed monopolies. They made people larger so that you could demand a price. They were thinking that if you raised prices and then you mandated what people were paid, so you raised wages disproportionate to the marketplace, that inhibited the marketplace.
No, that's absolutely right. And look at something like, say, the Durbin Amendment, which said, we think that you're paying too much for your debit card fees. We're going to mandate that banks cut the price that they pay to merchants, and that's gonna cut costs for consumers. Well, guess what? Today, Bank of America announces that now
$5.
Every consumer has to pay $5 for a debit card. Right. Why? Because the Durbin Amendment blew a $2 billion hole in Bank of America's revenues.
Right.
And you know what else? It's not just the cost to the consumer. 500 workers in Texas lost their jobs last week because a bank, who also had a hole blown in their balance sheet by the Durbin Amendment, decided that they weren't going to raise prices, they were going to cut costs, so they fired people.
So the debit card now means you've got a debt. The additional thing that I learned is the Wagner Act, which allowed for unions to be strong against these villainous owners in the 1930s, led to wildcat strikes, illegal strikes, shutdowns, sort of what you'd have to say is labor terrorism, because plants couldn't count on their assembly lines. That inhibited the marketplace. And it wasn't until they corralled the wildcat strikes that business worked again. That's similar to some of the activities of these public unions I mentioned as an analogy. It's the same, reproducing the same thing. What looks to be well-intentioned, keeping people in their jobs, turns out to lengthen the recession.
And create more damage. Absolutely.
So, having been an academic here, Mary, and having done my homework, it's not a great depression. It's a recession. All this can be fixed.
We're not in a second recession yet, John.
Right.
Don't use the double dip.
All this can be fixed with a change in the weather in Washington. It's not profound. It's not us, right, Mary?
This can be fixed. America can be fixed.
Mary Kissel of the Wall Street Journal editorial board. I'm John Batchelor. Thanks, Mary. This is the John Batchelor Show.